a Small Planet, which sold some 3 million copies since it's been published, but the author of 18 books, and strangely also the recipient of 18 honorary degrees. A native of Oregon by birth, Texas by upbringing, a graduate of Earlham College, which has, of course, a long tradition in environment and ecological ideas, faculty, and programs. Founder of the foundation, the founder of the Small Planet Institute, and the book Diet for a Small Planet and the foundation Small Planet Institute really have, before the rest of us started talking about a low carbon footprint and organic agriculture and community supported agriculture, Francis was out there ahead of the crowd with these ideas, promoting them, showing the advantages that they can offer to environmental sustainability. Tonight, in cooperation with Merritt Bookstore, which will have a signing of her book right after her remarks here, Francis will talk about her newest book, EcoMind, Changing the Way We Think to Create the World We Want. And without further ado, let me turn the podium over to Francis Moore Lappé for what I'm sure will be great remarks.
Thank you. Thank you, thank you. I am just thrilled to be here. I've just enjoyed every second and every morsel of the delicious food I was given, and just such an outstanding space to be able to speak in, and thank you for coming. Thank you, Dr. Schlesinger, Lori, Quinlan, wherever you are. You've been wonderful. I would like to set the mood by referring to the words of the founder of Visa, who once wrote, "It is far too late and things are far too bad for pessimism." So that's the note I want to sound tonight. I try to keep that in my head all the time. Now, I want to ask you, though, two questions, two serious questions. First of all, and I know this is a very special audience, so I kind of can guess the answer, but I'm going to ask you anyway, how many of you are worried, really worried, about the fate of our beautiful planet? Yeah. Now I'm going to ask you a second question that is so important to me. How many of you feel that you have a personal hypothesis, that you have a working theory about how we got into this mess? And how many of you think that that working hypothesis orients you, gives you a sense of personal power to turn this planet toward life? Yeah. Okay, well, the numbers shrink. I'm impressed by your courage to be one to say yes to that, because to me, that is foundational. If we don't have a working hypothesis, how can we feel personally empowered to know where to make our entry point around that downward sense of failure that so many of us experience today in terms of our societies? So it's all important. And so, let me just add, the reason I think it's all important is, and I'd love to discuss this with you in a Q&A, that I think that solutions are either known to most every one of our serious global problems, from global climate change to global hunger, or they're right around the corner. They're just right in front of our nose. So the problem for me, the real problem, is not these issues. It is our feeling of powerlessness to manifest the solutions that are largely known. So this idea that we need a working hypothesis where we see how our personal power makes a difference can move us from that powerlessness to empowerment. So that's my case. And I know that you're all working on that, but since I have the mic tonight, I'm going to share with you my personal hypothesis. And I want you to see if it works for you in any way and to push back, be engaged. I hope. Let me add, speaking of that, being engaged, there will be a sign-up sheet circulating that is our quarterly e-letter. We don't deluge you, we don't just flood you with emails. We do a quarterly newsletter if you're interested. We, meaning my daughter Anna Lappé, who is the author of Diet for a Hot Planet. So that's the Small Planet Institute, and that'll be going around if you'd like to sign up. So what is this? What is this hypothesis that's taken me 41 years to get to? Let me start where I began. I was a very desperate young woman, 41, 42 years ago, trying to understand what was my place in the world. And at the time, we were being told that, in fact, we'd hit the limits to feed ourselves. Paul Ehrlich's book, The Population Bomb, exploded in the late 60s, and I was very affected by it. Is it really true that we are running out of food? And I thought, is that really true? So to ground us in that, I'll just share this with you. There I am asking the question, is it true that we're really running out of food to feed people? And as I kind of put two and two together, almost literally, in the UC Berkeley Agricultural Library, I soon realized what is more true today, what was true then, that there's more than enough for each of us to eat well with the food that we're currently producing. And more than I learned that we're actively creating scarcity from plenty as we feed now a third of our grain to livestock, as we feed now a third or more of our fish catch to animal feed as well. So that question, why hunger, kept growing. It grew to then why hunger in a world of plenty, but ultimately grew to this question. This is the question that propels my life. How do I make sense of the fact that we are together creating a world that we as individuals would never choose? Because I bet you do not know anyone, certainly I don't, who gets up in the morning and says, yeah, I think we definitely should work for another child dying of hunger today. No, and yet thousands are. Nor does anybody get up and say, yeah, what can I do to disrupt the climate on the planet? And yet it's happening. So how can we make sense of this? That we are creating a world that actually violates our deepest sensibilities. And to answer that question, I've struggled to think, okay, what's special about us? What's distinct about us? And I've been helped by many great thinkers in answering this question, my hypothesis, everything working hypothesis, not the truth. But over time, I came to see what is more evidence for today, that one of our distinct qualities is that we human beings see the world according to what my daughter and I call a mental map, what Erich Fromm calls in his Anatomy of Human Destructiveness, a frame of orientation. It is a cultural filter through which we all see. That's just who we are. So this cultural filter is then made up of the core assumptions about how life works, what human nature is, and therefore it determines literally what we can see and what we cannot see. And to bring this home, I want to tell you a very homey story. Last Thanksgiving, I got up in the morning ready to make my root vegetable dish because 33 people were coming in the afternoon. And I rushed to the cupboard where I was certain my Dutch oven was, and it wasn't there. So I looked in the other cupboard, I looked in the basement, and I couldn't find the thing, and I finally gave up. And then about an hour later, I turn around, and there it is. Except that, as you will see in a moment, it had a plant in it. It had a plant in it, so it didn't fit my mental map. I was looking for something to cook root vegetables in, not something that holds a plant. So literally, because it was outside of my mental map, I wasn't expecting it, I could not see it, even though it's big and red. And finally, I did see it, and I laughed and said, perfect evidence for my theories here. So this is well and good. There's nothing necessarily terrible about this dimension of human consciousness if our mental map is serving life. But what if you and I are alive in this moment where the dominant map that we're absorbing unconsciously is fundamentally life-denying? And that's really what my thesis is tonight. And here it is, boiled down to really simple terms. I call it the scarcity mind is what we absorbed. The idea that there's not enough of anything. There's not enough food, there's not enough energy, there's not enough goodness in us. If If you strip away the fluff, we're just shelfish little shoppers. So this lack, this premise of lack, creates the scarcity mind, which I'm claiming then ends up creating the very scarcity that we say we so fear. So the thesis really is that we hear the expression, seeing is believing, but in reality, for human beings, believing is seeing. So what do we believe is all important? And I call this the dominant map. I call it the scarcity mind for the reason that it is, in simplest form, it is this mechanical worldview that reality is made up of separate entities, more or less static. You know, if we have one climate since we've been born, then of course we're going to have that climate in the future. No. Stasis. And primarily this theory of what I'm calling, this premise of what I'm calling of lack of goods and goodness is the scarcity piece, not enough of anything. So starting from the premise of these three S's, I was very proud of myself when I got it into three S's, that what then happens is that we live in cultures driven by fear of being without, and we then do not trust ourselves. We do not trust our neighbors. It's not a surprise to me that then depression becomes a global pandemic that it is today, the fourth leading cause of loss of productive life expected to rise, and that suicide causes 50% more deaths than homicide in our world today, starting from this premise that is so frightening and so distrusting of who we are. And so what happens then, my hypothesis is that it moves us into this spiral of powerlessness. Remember, I began saying that this is the crux of the problem because solutions are known or right around the corner. So it's our feeling of powerlessness that is the problem. And this is a schematic way of describing what I'm trying to say tonight. That if we start from this premise of lack, and we certainly see lack in ourselves, that's what we focus on, then of course we can't trust ourselves to come together with one another in common problem solving, what we call democracy. No, that's not really possible because we are all separate and so selfish. So therefore, we want to look for some automatic force, some infallible law that will just sort out things for us because we are too flawed to negotiate solutions for the common good. And many think that we found it. We heard about it in the 1980s for the first time, described as magic. Ronald Reagan described it as the magic of the marketplace. And from that premise then, what happens? We see then wealth accrue to wealth because it is with just one idea of a marketplace. That idea is that a marketplace can work if it's basically set up like monopoly. Highest return to existing wealth. Accrues wealth, accrues to wealth, accrues to wealth. And so we end up today in a world in which 71% of the people are living in societies where inequalities are increasing. And we end up in the US where Citigroup researchers in 2005 said we are now a plutonomy because 1% of us control as much wealth as the bottom 90% put together. So then that infects and distorts our political decision making, actually contributing then to greater worsening inequalities, extreme poverty. And then we say, see, I told you so. We really are these selfish little critters. We really can't come together in common problem solving. And the spiral of powerlessness quickens. So that's the negative that I'm saying we're trapped in based on this premise of lack, the scarcity mind. And so what happens then is that we end up in this world of extreme concentration of wealth. We end up in a world in which the US, for example, has greater inequality, economic inequality than Yemen or Pakistan. But we also, and I'm going to focus tonight on our food economy in particular, we end up in a society in which there are now just 3 grain traders who control most of the world's grain trade, 3 agrochemical companies that control most of the sales of pesticides and fertilizers, and 10 supermarkets that are responsible for most of half the products in U.S. supermarkets, and on and on and on. So then what you have is more and more food produced, and yet more hunger than ever in human history, now almost 1 billion people. And as I said, what happens then is that it infects the political system, and so we end up with what I love to call privately held government. But it was perfectly described, I think, for us with a warning that Franklin Delano Roosevelt presented to Congress in April of 1938, when he said these words. He said, "The liberty of democracy is not safe if a people tolerate the growth of private power to the point that it becomes stronger than the democratic state itself. That, in its essence, is fascism." I have to admit that I can't bring myself yet to use the F word without quoting Franklin Delano Roosevelt. But this, to me, is a very eloquent, very clear statement of what I call privately held government that is not the democracy that I grew up believing in. And so here we are. We are in this predicament, and I'm suggesting in the whole talk tonight is this notion that the reason that we are moving backward is that this frame, this scarcity scare, this scarcity mind that has now been, I believe, widely disproved in all the sciences, more or less, is so perversely aligned with wider nature and with human nature that it ends up actually creating the opposite of where we want to go. So this is the beginning of the foundation of the problem, and I'm also suggesting that a way of understanding why it is manifesting what we say we most fear is that one of the beauties of moving from this and beginning to think like an ecosystem, as the theme of my book, which I'm just going to be turning to now with the EcoMind, is that we see human beings as organisms in a social ecology that, like any organism in nature, is affected and shaped by the stimuli around it. So when I say that this spiral of powerlessness is perversely aligned with human nature, here's what I mean. If we look at history and we look at lab experiments about what brings out the very worst in human beings, I think we have some pretty good clues. Whether you're talking about genocide, or the Holocaust, or you're talking about lab experiments like the Stanford prison experiment, in which ordinary, tested, normal young people were in an experiment. Do you know this experiment in 1971 in Stanford prison experiment, where some were assigned the role of guards, some assigned the role of prisoners, and the experiment Philip Zimbardo carried out was supposed to last for 2 weeks, and they had to stop it in 6 days because the brutality was so intense that he said later it reminded him of what we saw from the images of Abu Ghraib. So we know that there are certain conditions that bring out very bad things in us. Not a few of us, but most of us. And so my claim is that this scarcity scare, the scarcity mind that ends up with such concentration of power, yikes, it brings out exactly the conditions that are shown to bring out the worst. Concentrated power, lack of transparency or secrecy. Think about what happened on Wall Street with the slicing and dicing of these toxic derivatives. I understand that one of the slogans that many of these traders used was IBG, YBG. I'll be gone, you'll be gone. So there's no transparency here, I'll be out the door. So concentrated power, secrecy, and the third is the culture of blame. It's not me, it's them. It's Wall Street or it's the homeless. Whoever, it's the other guy. The blame game. So culture of blame is the third. And I'm suggesting that if we start from the premise of scarcity of goods and goodness and put ourselves in this spiral where we give over our power, we end up with exactly the conditions shown to bring out the worst in us. So that is what I want to suggest, that if we understand, then we can begin a positive turn. Because actually, throughout hard, soft, natural sciences, there have been enormous breakthroughs. Certainly not just in the last few decades, but accelerating. And so I want to suggest that there is another worldview emerging that is evidence-based, science-based, and can help us orient and break out of the spiral of powerlessness into a spiral of empowerment. So I call it, instead of the three, sorry, I just covered that. Instead of the three S's, I've got it to three C's. What is emerging is, of course, the understanding that all of life is connected, that change is the only constant in a sense, and therefore we are each co-creators with other organisms, of course, in the social and natural ecosystems. So this is a very different way of understanding life that is emerging. And I'd love to quote one of my teachers, in effect, the physiologist at Oxford in England, who wrote a beautiful book, Dennis Noble, who wrote The Music of Life. I highly recommend it. It's a small book. Do any of you know that book, The Music of Life, where he says, in biological systems, there are no privileged components telling the rest what to do. There is rather a form of democracy in which all elements are interacting and shaping one another. And also, I love to quote another hero of mine, the physicist Hans-Peter Durer in Germany, who said to me once, not too long ago, Frankie, in biological systems, there are no parts, there are only participants. And so from this emergent view, which I call the EcoMind, we see life as fluid, we see ourselves as co-creators, and understand, as Hans-Peter told me, there are no parts, only participants. And so this is the beginning of the breaking free. And so from this notion, we start talking then about not, for example, the scarcity mind focuses on limited quantities of things. The eco-mind focuses us, and this, I was reading your mission statement for Carrie and other things on the train here, and I love some of the language that I feel is consistent, and tell me where it's not, but it feels so beautifully aligned with what I'm trying to describe here. That we then shift to a focus from this narrow fixation on more, say, in the world of world hunger. It's how can we produce more food, not what are the systems that enable people to actually eat that food that we produce. And so it is a shift then from quantities to a focus on relationships. And we then can see that how we can break free from some of the scariest messages. One of the things that I do in EcoMind is I take some of the messaging of many of us in the environmental movement that often have used the term, we've hit the limits of a finite planet, which can keep us back into that fear mode of the scarcity mind and focuses on limits, whereas this EcoMind focuses on alignment, focuses on aligning our economic and social choices with what we know of human nature and what we know of nature more broadly. And so I'm going to start then with the human being again. What do we know about ourselves? There's a great deal of new learning from anthropology and sociology, but also from neuroscience, so much so that Michael Tomasello has written a book called Why We Cooperate that describes this as really a revolution in understanding human nature. And so we start there and think from an EcoMind perspective of what do we have, what has evolved through our interaction with others, what has evolved in us over eons of time, primarily in our tribal roots, that now could move out of this fearful scarcity mind into this fluid and co-creative eco-mind. And so I list these 6. I don't have time to go into them here. I'll just mention that behind each of these items on this list, I think there's quite a bit of research, and particularly I recommend the work of anthropologist Sarah Blaffer Hardy, because she describes how in our tightly knit tribes we're that we evolved as a particularly cooperative species, and she has a theory about why. But we see that showing up today. One of my favorite examples is looking at that research that was done at Emory University in Atlanta, where they looked with functional MRIs at our brains when we were either cooperating or competing, and they find that when we cooperate, that actually it's so pleasurable, it's like eating chocolate and other wonderful pleasures of life. But this is a suggestion that that of course that we knew that cooperating allowed the tribe to thrive, and therefore cooperating was really a good thing. And likewise with the sense of fairness, there's some evidence that we understood in our tribal roots that fair rules, fairly applied, meant that the tribe would stay together. So that little 2-year-old who says it's not fair, that's a reflection of something very deep in us about the need for fairness. So I'm arguing tonight that we have what we need now. So the question is, what are the conditions that will bring out these qualities? And they are the opposite of the three that I mentioned earlier. Then the continuous dispersion of power, transparency in human relationships, and the shift from the culture of blame to the culture of mutual accountability, where we all understand that if we're all connected, we're all implicated, right? We are all implicated. And on that transparency thing, I'm reminded of a study I saw where at a university setting, the faculty weren't paying for their free coffee at the coffee station at the honor system. And so somebody thought, oh, we'll just put a picture of a pair of human eyes above the coffee station. And guess what? They got, a vast increase in people who were actually paying for their coffee. So we know we do better when things are transparent. So I think that's something vital to remember. And so therefore, then we can start moving into what I'm calling the spiral of empowerment. And we can then start from a very different premise, that because we have these qualities, we're capable, under the right conditions, of deliberative problem solving. We can step up and remove the power of private wealth over our political system, what I was calling privately held government. And then we can start this virtual cycle, which I'm going to be talking about in just a moment, which I call living democracy. Democracy not as something done to us or for us, but something that is kind of an ecology of democracy. It is a focus on the quality of relationships in our social system, not simply one factor of who has the wealth. And so then we start moving into this positive cycle, which means that we can then move, as I was saying earlier, this is the summary, really, of what I'm suggesting tonight, to move from this notion that we've hit the limits of nature to the idea of aligning with the laws of nature. I argue that this frame of hitting the limits of nature still traps us, as I said, into the scarcity mind. And if we realize that something from 55% to 87% of the energy, for example, in the US is wasted, depending on which scientist you're reading, but it's huge either way. Or if we think of the food in the US, I just read the figure 1,400 calories are wasted every day. 1,400 calories per person wasted every day in the United States. That's enough almost to feed the entire US population over again. So I'm saying that this hitting the limits doesn't capture the reality, if the reality is from if we are creating the scarcity out of plenty. And the idea then of aligning with the laws of nature, which I'm going to give us some images now, means that what? We can take a deep breath. We can kind of let go of some of that fear of lack and begin to work creatively with one another and share the stories of this emergent EcoMind. And from my life experience, as you know, I started on food because I thought that food would be the handle, that we all eat, we all like to talk about food. Food connects us to one another, etc. And that I'm coming even more now in 41 years since Diet for a Small Planet to think that the power of food to move us from the scarcity mindset to the eco-mind. And so I want to talk for a minute and just use examples from from the emergent food movement globally, although this is a wonderful picture of the U.S. But it summarizes for me there in those few words the particular power of food to help us crack the fear of scarcity mind. And why is that true? Well, I think that the movement for sustainable food, if you will, eco-food, worldwide, embodies, in a sense, it necessitates the kind of dispersion of power, the kind of transparency, and the kind of mutuality. If you're thinking about community-supported agriculture, what is that? It's about, instead of just pointing the finger, it's saying, I'm going to step up and be an investor with the farmer. I'm going to work with the farmer. So I think the food movement in all its many dimensions on every continent today embodies some of the elements required for that is manifesting this EcoMind. And so I just want to start with ecological agriculture for a moment because of the possibility of our seeing then the small farmers throughout the world who are now among the poorest. About half of the world's hungry are now themselves rural people who are agriculturalists. To shift to see that these people in many ways are a pathway for addressing our global climate crisis and our poverty crisis. And so I just want to point to this statistic. That when my daughter wrote Diet for a Hot Planet about the impact of agriculture and our food system on climate change, the estimates were that about a third of the global climate crisis is related to greenhouse gas emissions that are connected in some way to our food system. Recently, I've read the more and more research is done. And if you include even more things, starting with the burning of forest down to the refrigeration of things in supermarkets, there are credible estimates that, and I can tell you how to look at this overview study that I just saw, that as much as 57% of greenhouse gas problem for our planet that has thrown our carbon cycle out of whack is related to our food system, as I say, from the burning of forest to the refrigeration. So I just think it's really important that we then focus on, for a moment here, a possibility around the small farm of the world, who still produces most of the world's food, by the way. So that's really important to keep in mind. So I just want to tell you a couple of stories that are those the kind that get me up in the morning. And one of them will take, my first really short story here takes us to Niger. Niger, if you've been following the news about famine in Africa, it's one of the worst hits, 6 million people faced with famine. At the very same time, this West African country that's threatened with desertification, in fact, most of the country is considered near desert. Nevertheless, in southern Niger, farmers began almost 20 years ago realizing that the colonial approach, which made them think that trees were a problem to agriculture and didn't encourage them to integrate trees into their farming, they realized that was wrong. That trees, actually, the roots of the trees can not only allow the little amount of rain that falls to actually get into the earth instead of run off, so it's useful. The roots of many of these tree species actually fix nitrogen, so you have a natural fertilizer. The leaves of the trees can be used for fodder. The limbs can be used for firewood. The fruit can be eaten. And so they started nurturing the trees in their fields and creating almost a form here of agroforestry, although this is mainly the agro piece of it. And look at that number. 12.5 million acres of land re-greened that had been near desert through this initiative of small farmers teaching each one approach that has allowed the growth of 200 million trees to this. And I just got a report before I left home the day before yesterday that it looks like, although it's way too early to have a thorough study done, but that the areas that had been regreened, that some of them at least, I should say, to be more specific, there was one area, but it was quite a large number of people, almost 400,000 people in this region, actually had been producing surplus food during this last few years of intense famine in so much of the country. That was a regreened area, and they're bringing school kids into the process as well. And they find that the trees, when there is a drought condition that means the crops don't grow well, the trees then can supply leaves for fodder and fruit that can be sold for income. And I saw one estimate that a farmer can make as much as $75 by selling without killing the tree, just by selling the fruit to the tree. And for a family that's living on, a few $100s a year, that's enormous, So this is just one, the shift our lens from the scarcity mind to the EcoMind, we start seeing this kind of possibility. And I've yet to, talk about my excitement about Niger to virtually anyone who's heard about what's going on there. And this is the kind of story that I think we need to tell. Likewise, in Andhra Pradesh, India, which has been called the pesticide capital of the world, and farmer suicides were among the worst in all of India, starting less than 10 years ago. Fewer than 10 years ago, this movement of led by village women toward what they call non-pesticide agriculture has begun to take hold. And again, look at this number, 8,000 villages, and involving about 300,000 farmers. And I've forgotten the acreage at this moment, but it's quite extensive. And the beauty of it is that it's not just the relationship of the land that is changing, but the relationships of the community. The gender relationships are changing because this is in a large measure a women-led movement. The woman here is checking, this elder is responsible for checking the seeds, which ones can be saved, should be saved. They've started these seed-saving caravans that go around village to village teaching. It's a big festival in February now of each year, teaching how to save and share seeds so that their costs are going way down because they're not dependent on commercial inputs. Remember I talked about the 3 companies in the world that control most of pesticides sales and fertilizer sales in the world? Well, these folks were spending about a third of their cost of farming was to buy those products. And now that they're not, they're moving away from them, creating their own pest control potions, I call them, their own seed sharing. Their profits are going significantly up. And they are in this spiral then of empowerment. And so this story from Andhra Pradesh, again, and I should add, now 2 state agencies, the Rural Development and the Agricultural Development, are teaming up to support and want to engage. There are now 930,000 women self-help groups that they want to spread this approach through. And so it has really gained a lot of visibility in this region. So I really want to emphasize, as I move here to the final part of my talk, is that if you can see my excitement, I hope, of these kinds of stories of possibility, I call them, that show what can happen when people start believing in themselves and start just deferring to authority or to some magical force beyond them and start taking initiative. And so you see that I kind of think from my list of 6 qualities that we human beings are good enough. We have these potential pro-social qualities if the context brings them out. And so what do we need to work on? And my claim tonight is that what we need to work on is what I call bold humility. And I want to explain this. Bold humility involves 2 things. It involves rethinking fear itself. I've spoken tonight about how we evolved in tightly knit tribes. And one of the good things, one of the bad things is that we're so tightly knit and we're so dependent on them. Breaking with the tribe was really the scariest thing of all. But what if we're alive right now when the hypertribe is heading over Victoria Falls, then separating from the pack is suddenly life. It's affirming life, but it's still scary. And so we need to rethink fear. We need to rethink fear. We're good enough, but it's really hard for us to be different. And so what I'm suggesting is that rather than thinking of fear as a verdict, that we're, you know, what, we've got to freeze, fight, or flee, right? Isn't that what we're supposed to be programmed to do? What if we thought of fear as energy, just information that we could take to shift ourselves from the scarcity mind to the EcoMind and see possibility? And this is the boldness part. And I know it's hard to shift, and I know in myself it sometimes takes some really cheesy tricks, so I have one that I will share with you. I was in an audience sitting like you are and watching Inconvenient Truth debut in Boston with all of my closest friends. And Al Gore walked in, and I could feel like this collective bow about to happen. And in my gut, I was really upset with Al Gore because he didn't come on to say, look, I wanted him to say, I've been there, I've been in Washington, I've seen the control that corporations have. You people, you citizens, we've got to stand up together and have our voices. You know, you need to not end on light bulbs, you need to end on power. So I was scared. I was really scared because I knew if I raised my hand, you know, that I wouldn't be part of that collective bow, and my friends would be embarrassed. So, but then I had this moment where my heart was going crazy. It'd go, bah, bah, bah. And usually when it does that, I say, oh, you wimp. And it doesn't, you know, doesn't get me very far. But that night I said, okay, I'm just going to rename that inner applause. And so I said, you know, just, yeah, go for it. And I got my hand up, but he never called on me. But you get the idea. We've got to, when we feel that kind of fear, just reframe it. Oh, we're just where we need to be. So that's but the humility part is different. The humility part is this, is that when my daughter and I traveled the world together to write Hope's Edge, we met these extraordinary, like these kinds of stories all over the world. And I came back and I said, oh my gosh, if somebody had told me any of this when I was your age, honey, I would have given it no chance of success. That is humbling. That is humbling. So, if that's true, then, maybe I'd better just kind of withhold, and maybe I should, you know, just not think that I know it. Maybe it's not possible to know what's possible. So, what I'm going to do in that spirit is suggest that one way to develop that humility, which is so empowering, that we don't know that we can't do it. And the way to keep that kind of humility going is to carry with us these stories of people who've just stepped out and done what we couldn't imagine being done. And so I just want to share with you a few other people or things that are going on in the world that give me that sense of, oh, really? Yeah, maybe it doesn't have to stay so stuck in the scarcity mind. And one of them, you may not have ever heard of Deborahcitizen, but hey, if I had met Deb in the year 2000 when she was a waitress in Maine in a diner, would I have thought that she would ever be a state leader of high repute? No. But her friends saw that in her. They said, Deborah, you should run for the state legislature. And she thought they were nuts because she didn't have any money. And they said, no, Deb, you're not paying attention. We have clean elections in Maine, voluntary public financing. All you have to do is get $5 for 50 people. And she said, oh, I'm a waitress. I think I can do that. And she did. She did. And Deb then went on to become first a rep and now a state senator. She helped pass some groundbreaking environmental legislation in the state of Maine. Why? Because neither Deb nor her colleagues, 80% of them, ran without corporate money. And the same kind of legislation, fair elections, you can find at fairelectionsnow.org in both houses of Congress. We citizens can insist that our legislators pass legislation that enable people to run a credible campaign without corporate money and selectively say, we're going to support those kinds of folks. This is one of that kind of bold humility, right? I would never have imagined. And it's happening, and she's proof. I think also of, I'm going to jump to Brazil, because think about it. This was really just sinking in on me the other night, that as late as 1984, Brazil was in a military dictatorship. And yet, by 2003, they were able to elect a worker as president who put zero hunger, fome zero, as a goal, and then ultimately put the right to food into the constitution of the country. Think of that. Since the time of Reagan to now, they've gone from a military dictatorship to this, in fact, this campaign that has greatly reduced hunger. And here are some smiling faces that show you that. This is a poverty rate that is down. This is actually the most conservative estimate I've seen. In terms of infant mortality, death, that is often associated with hunger, it's been cut over the decade we've just left by at least a third. And so this is what I'm suggesting then, is that if they can do it in Brazil, if they can have parties that are really listening to citizens' desire for basic fairness, why not here? For example, part of the Zero Hunger campaign, they now have a law in Brazil that 30% of provisioning for school lunches and hospitals has to come from local small farmers. And then, if somebody had told me this, 800 million people are members of cooperatives, moving to the EcoMind idea of economic life, mutual accountability, that's what co-ops are about, right? One person, one vote. And I calculate, conservatively I think, that there are more people who are now members of co-ops than there are people who own shares in publicly traded companies. And this is the year of the cooperative. So again, if you look, say, at who would have thought, say, a country like India, that there are more women who have created dairy co-ops and jobs in dairy co-ops in India than in all the high-tech jobs put together. So this is another example of this idea that if we suspend our disbelief that is created by the scarcity mind and actually go with this sense of possibility and the sense of the kinds of things that create that sense of possibility, the mutual accountability, for example, of governments that are really listening to the citizen, as I mentioned in Maine, where corporate money is removed, or in Brazil, where a workers' party was able actually to elect a worker. These are the kinds of examples that I think build this. But even more so, I should also mention that this is another form of what I consider the EcoMind emerging in social relationships, where direct participation of citizens in decision-making, such as in, you may have heard of food policy councils in New York, Seattle, San Francisco. They're major innovations of bringing all stakeholders to the table to begin to create a food system that works for us all. And down to the example of direct participation in ecological governance in India, where the centralized control of managing the forest has devolved, and the government has devolved into 10 million households who participate in forest management groups to preserve and enable the forest to flourish. And they're one of the reasons that India actually has forests that are healthier in recent years, where so many are continuing to deforest. So these are just other examples to give you the sense of what I'm calling a living democracy, not democracy done to us or for us, but democracy as a living practice, and how it connects so closely with what many people are doing in the areas of food and farming. So this is part then of what gives me that sense of bold humility. But how do we maintain it is the key here. And I will close with this thought, that if it's true that we are all connected, now we understand mirror neurons, studying mirror neurons, that we're so connected that You know, when I'm doing this with my hands, there are neurons in your brain that some of them are as if you were doing what I'm doing. We are so connected that we know then how to change ourselves by bringing into our lives stories of possibility, bringing into our lives people more courageous than we, because it's pretty certain that we're going to become more like the people who we bring into our lives. We can use this consciousness of this, trying to stimulate this spiral of empowerment. And so I introduce you to Wangari Maathai. Many of you know my hero. She passed away in September 2011. But she has been my lodestar of courage. Why? She planted 7 trees on Earth Day in 1977 to honor 7 women environmentalists in Kenya. She had the idea that she could fight the desert by helping women to be tree planters, to reforest Kenya. She fought against the deforestation. She was scoffed at by foresters and then imprisoned, beaten by the dictator at the time, Moore Lappé. What did she do? She just kept going. Trees, nurseries organized by village women throughout Kenya, 45 million trees are now flourishing in Kenya because of those 7. And then in 2004, Wangari got the call from Sweden that she had been awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. So with that standing, she reached out to the she went to the UN Environmental Program and said, let's start an international campaign, Plant for the Planet. Have you ever heard of Plant for the Planet? Oh, somebody actually has. Because I only accidentally heard about it in a high school in Leipzig, Germany. But guess what? With Wangari's inspiration, they set the goal of 1 billion trees a year planted throughout the world. And when I first heard about that, I thought, oh, that's nice. Isn't that a bit ambitious? You know, I hope they're not too disappointed, but I'm going to buy one for my granddaughter and plant it tomorrow, and I did. But I really didn't have, a lot of confidence. You little thing. Then, last year when I was finishing EcoMind, I went to the UN Environmental Program website, and we have hit over 11 billion trees. So this story, Wangari is my lodestar. She just kept walking. Those 7 trees became 45 million trees, became 7 billion trees. And so Wangari's life teaches me the most important idea of an eco-mind, and that is that it's not possible to know what's possible. And that is our freedom. I'd like to end with a short poem by Denise Levertov. If I can. It's called Beginners. We have only begun to love the earth. We have only begun to imagine the fullness of life. How can we tire of hope? So much is in bud. How can desire fail? We have only begun to imagine justice and mercy. We have only begun to envision how it might be to live as sibling with beast and flower, no longer as oppressor. We have only begun to know the power that is ours if we would join our solitudes in a communion of struggle. So much is unfolding that must complete its gesture. So much is in bud. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you.
Frances did say she'd take a few questions, so we'll open the floor. Brave soul will start here.
Remember that inner applause.
There you are.
It was a wonderful presentation. Thank you. Very inspiring. I'm very prosaic, but
Good.
doesn't need to approach the heights and levels you talk about. But it seems to be very fundamental to your thesis and to the structure of what you presented. That is obviously the money in politics.
Yes, thank you.
You gave examples of an local basis, the story of the Congresswoman, the Assemblywoman in Maine. The fact is, in reality, in this country, I don't know how we get money out of politics today and for quite a long time to come. And it seems that we don't need to debate that up to the big political speech, but it's there. In fact, it's getting more in depth. It's getting more strong. You see it. And so it seems to me that the circle, the spirals that we talked about, are, let me say, we seem to be stuck at the money in politics.
Thank you.
3/5 into the circle, either way, for bad or for good. And so I just wonder what you see for the foreseeable future in kind of counteracting that, what I consider to be now fact of life.
Yes, but that fact of life is the issue, isn't it? Because why does this go on? This is a bipartisan concern. This is a bipartisan outrage. I mean, the vast majority of us feel that money has too much sway in Washington. This is 80-something%. I've seen up to 90 across all political spectrum. So why? Because we feel powerless. Because we feel there's nothing we can do. And that's why, no matter what I like to put it this way, no matter what your first passion is, just make your second one. Make your second one. Just weighing in. They're now in Congress. Fair Elections Now. Go to fairelectionsnow.org. And there are over 130 co-sponsors in the House for a version, a modified to work at a national level, a version of the Maine approach. And the biggest thing we have to fight, what is your name, sir? What is your name? Tom. Tom, the biggest thing that we have to fight is that feeling that it is just a fact of life. It is not something we can change. And we have to tell stories of how it is, what happened in Maine when this, we have to share stories about what is possible, and we have to actively, how many of you have ever heard of Fair Elections Now legislation, right? Probably not many. Or did you know, for example, back to my second item, that transparency item, that the Disclose Act, which would in itself have required that corporations that are giving money to political causes have to tell the public and their shareholders, which seems like a minimal standard, that lost by one vote in the Senate. And yet none of my friends, even though I consider myself part of this world, I didn't know that was happening. That was in 2010. So we have, I'm just asking if we keep that number 2, that if we really see that as such a juggernaut, is so central, that it can't be just left to the policy wonks. And so any of you are interested in that, please, it's so easy to find on smallplanet.org. But I'm so glad that was the first question, because sometimes our eyes just glaze over because we feel it is hopeless. But I honestly, I think we're kidding ourselves if we think we can solve our problems, the world's problems, without real democracy. And we've got to believe that we can have it.
Another one over here against the wall there.
Yes. My question regards Israel and the original planting of trees.
Can you speak a little louder?
Sorry. My question involves Israel and the model that was created to bring the desert into what is now a garden and use of trees and planting trees. Is that being used at all today too in the world, used as a basis for production in other countries?
Huh. That's a good question. Is there anyone here? I don't know the answer to that. Is there any Israeli expert on?
You have to take into account that what happened in Israel happened with a huge infusion of money from the U.S. It happened on the backs of a genocide or an ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. So I don't know if that's the model we want to look to. My question was not at all political.
Yeah, it was about the ecological, but I don't know.
The cleaning of the desert took place in the wake of this infusion of money and of ethnic cleansing. So I don't see how you can separate the two.
Okay, I'm sorry.
The gentleman over there who had his hand up against the wall.
Thank you. A lot of people I talk to see that there's a shifting in the mindset going on, of the kind that you're talking about. But the industrialism seems to be the source of the inequalities in our, ever since industrialism arose, there's been this clash. Is industrialism part of the problem, the industrial process, and if so, how do we shift away from industrialism?
Well, I'm not, I was asked to repeat the question, how is industrialism part of the problem, and how, if it is, then do we shift away? I'm not, it would be, I think, a longer conversation to define what you mean by industrialism. Certainly, I think that science and technology can be developed in ways, and are being developed in ways that are aligned with the laws of nature rather than I mean, if you take, for example, one of the things I was reading on the plane, or I'm sure you're familiar with the work of Amory Lovins, for example, and he has a new book out called The Reinvention of Fire, is that something like that? And you know, the ways, and Amory Lovins is the last person who would, I mean, he works with corporations, so he wouldn't be saying we are going to de-industrialize, but it's a beautiful book. I highly recommend his work, showing how much waste and destruction, as I was pointing out earlier, is built into our one rule economy, this highest return to existing wealth, not incorporating the incredible externalities that are hurting us, the human species, and of course many other species. So it is really not, for me, I guess I would start the conversation that I'd love to have with you, that it's not industry versus non-industry, but what is industry, and how do we radically rethink it to serve life? I was just looking at the book this morning where he talked about Denmark that has increased, a lot of it industrial, increased its GDP by 2/3 since 1990, I think. I'm kind of blanking on the frame. But that had, over the same period, or maybe 1980, had over the same period reduced its carbon emissions by 21%. So that, you know, there are just such vast opportunities for, I mean, if you think of last year, 54% increase in solar globally, such incredible untapped possibility for meeting human needs for comfort and food and energy without disrupting nature as we are now. And I think that's where I want to see our focus going as we take that deep breath. But thank you for the question. I'm not sure I'm on it, but appreciate it. I'd love to talk more about it.
Francis, let's stop at this point and let you have some time for private conversations and some book signing outside.
Okay, can I just say one more thing about that?
You're in charge.
I am. Well, I want to share, when I did that pounding heart part, I was going to tell you something that makes my heart pound that I would ask you to consider participating in. With 6 distinguished scholars from various universities, I am campaigning. We have a petition campaign, very simple petition campaign that I would ask you to consider joining. We are asking Oxford University Press, which is, I consider, the gold standard of academic publishing, simply to evaluate its policies and to reaffirm these 3 scholarly standards for its publishing program. Citations for evidence-based claims, full disclosure of conflicts of interest, even if they're not directly financial, and an accurate representation of a publication in its promotion. Because you can see on our website, it's called Scholarly Standards at Work, Scholarly Standards at Risk, scholarlystandardsAtRisk.org, the issues that, and so far Oxford University Press has refused to even talk to us. And so there's a sign-up sheet out there. I could say that this one particular book that we're focused on, because all of these other scholars and I are concerned about issues of food and hunger, that the author of a particular book that we examined did not disclose that he was an advisor to the CEO of the Monsanto Corporation, even though he promotes the corporation in his work. And they say that because he wasn't paid by Monsanto, he didn't have to disclose that he was an advisor to the president. So if that interests you, because I'm gonna go to Oxford on April 25th, and I would love to deliver your signatures.
Excellent. Many thanks for
Thank
being
you
with us
so much.
tonight.
Thank you.
Momentarily to sign her book. Let me alert you to some upcoming programs here. April 27th, the Ned Ames Honorary Lecture on a Friday night by May Barabon from the University of Illinois. The World of Bees. May and I were graduate students at Cornell many years ago, and she has a wonderful presentation and energetic analysis of the problem with bees. May 5, Terry is tackling what I think is the biggest issue of the state of New York right now with a Saturday morning forum on hydraulic fracking for natural gas, in which we'll in 3 hours have, I believe it's 4 or 5 speakers representing various sides of policy, science, and the corporate world to give us their view of where we stand with hydraulic fracking at the present moment. Again, we put these programs on with support by people like you. Great to see you here tonight.